Thanks, Lindsay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second Electric Vehicle Infrastructure and Interconnection Working Group. Today, we will be discussing the SIR process, but first I'd like to introduce Jen Abrahams for some opening remarks.
Awesome, thanks, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jen Abrahams. I'm the Transportation Lead in the New York State Department of Public Service. Before I hand things back off to my colleague, Lisa Rossi, I just want to thank you all for taking the time to join us for this month's Electric Vehicle Infrastructure and Interconnection Working Group, or the EVIIWG. The flexibility and optimization opportunities offered by vehicle electrification and charging infrastructure really starts at the interconnection process. Building on last month's working group, as Lisa just mentioned, we'll be delving deeper into the existing standardized interconnection requirements, or the SIR, for distributed generation and energy storage, and compare this to the electric vehicle charging interconnection process. Overall goal here is identifying any issues, efficiencies that can be found in harmonizing these two processes for charging interconnection. Staff is looking to you all, utilities advocates, industry, subject matter experts, and the like, to refine our approach to electric vehicle interconnection. We really appreciate the discussion that's happened so far, as well as the written comments filed in response to the straw proposal, and encourage stakeholders to continue submitting comments and actively participate in today's conversation. Your feedback is incredibly valuable, so thank you so much to those who have provided it so far. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I'll hand it back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Jen. So for today's agenda includes a couple reminders. We have the straw proposal edits. We've had a number come in. Just keep them coming in, and I will summarize the comments and then add them to the straw proposal. And then the EVIWG, or EVIIWG, has its own matter number. It's 2400339. And you can add documents, comments, or other materials if you would like to in that matter number. And then I have received several comments and edits and started to incorporate them into the straw proposal already. So please keep them coming, as I stated earlier. And then Jason Pause, our very own Jason, will discuss the current SIR process for the distributed resources, distributed generators. And then Katie Zellner from Con Ed will discuss the differences between the interconnection of EVs and DGs. And we will have some discussion on questions that were posed at the last meeting. And lastly, we will identify next steps until the next EVIWG, which is June 7th. And I just wanted to remind everyone about the EVIIWG webpage, and it includes all the EVIIWG related documents, such as the dates of future meetings, recordings, meeting registration links, agendas, the straw proposal, and any other relevant information. Now we will turn to Jason, and he will discuss the SIR process. Thanks, Jason.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. You can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay. I want to shut my camera.
So good afternoon, everybody. This is Jason Pause. I'm in our electric safety and reliability section here at the Department of Public Service. And one of my roles and responsibilities is administering and looking after the standardized interconnection requirements of the Commission. The standardized interconnection requirements apply to new DG and energy storage systems 5 megawatts or less connected in parallel with the utility distribution system. And again, it's the SIR. The SIR provides application, review, approval, and minimum design installation requirements for DG and ESS interconnection projects. The SIR, the SIR also includes standard contract forms and associated requirements. And the latest version of the SIR is from this past February 1st, 2024, and that was modified as in case 22-E0137. Next slide, please. So I thought the best way kind of to go over this really was to just really look at the table of contents of the SIR and kind of walk through it. So that's kind of what I had planned for today. Section 1 of the SIR is the application process. And we have an introduction with kind of some background boilerplate information on interconnections. And then we get into section B here where it talks about application process for systems 50 kW or less. For this is for the most part the residential section for your typical rooftop, PV, and other small DER ESS interconnections. There's a couple exceptions that have been developed over the past years. So those are outlined where the utilities could apply for an exception for larger systems that are above 50 kW. And to be able to follow this faster, expedited process. And again, that's really the big benefit of this section here is that it's about a 20-day turnaround, 20 business day turnaround, if all the steps are, walked through in accordance with the SIR and there's no other delays. But overall, step 1 is um, the applicant, the initial communications. They determine the nature of the project in step 2, and then an applicant actually files an application, and it gets reviewed and identified for any issues or concerns and approval by the utilities. Once step 3 is successfully navigated, they get an applicant gets approval for system installation, and then they go through accordant facility testing, verification testing in accordance with the SIR, and then there's final acceptance. But overall, this is a pretty straightforward, hopefully not too burdensome for typical residential DER DG systems in our fast track process for 50 kW or less. But each of these steps, the important thing here is, each of the steps have a specific response deadline for, if it's targeted at the utility or the applicant, there's a specific timeline and deadline for response to help allow the process to continue moving forward. And that's something that we introduced back in the 2016 timeframe to help move the projects along, because the more projects sit and get put on hold or get stuck in the process, it holds up others behind them. So go to the next slide, please. Nope, there you go. Okay, so now we're in section C, and now we get into kind of the bigger projects of the application process for the SIR. It's projects 50 kW up to 5 megawatts, what we consider our non-residential. And again, there's an 11-step process here. Initial communications, still determining the nature of the project, and then the applicant files an application. And then it goes through, preliminary screens and supplemental screens, and those screens we can discuss those more later on, but those are an effort to kind of determine whether or not the project can, move forward through the process in a faster method versus going through a CSER. Again, the screens are intended to identify those projects that will have a lesser impact on the system and don't need a more in-depth CSER, which is the Coordinated Electric System Interconnection Review. Because that CSER takes up to 60 business days, so that's kind of the bulk of the review process for the utilities to perform during their analysis. And again, that can have up to 60 business days, and in some instances where it might be a more complex project, maybe a hybrid project with ESS and solar, or a more complicated design system, there is provisions to actually have it go even further than 60 business days if needed. But 60 business days is the main time frame for the CSER, and most projects have to go through a CSER nowadays because most of the projects that we see are in the 5 megawatt range. But if you are submitting a project and say below a megawatt, and hopefully it passes the preliminary screens, it can move forward in a much faster process and avoid a CSER. And then when the utility completes the CSER, the applicant commits to the utility construction and paying for the system modifications that are identified in the CSER. That's the big part of the CSER, is that the utilities obviously identify the impact, but also identify the upgrades that are needed. And those upgrades are paid for by the applicant. So once those are provided to the customer and the customer accepts that, then they can move forward and get into construction. And then after construction, step 9, again, kind of going along with the previous process, it's verification and testing, and then final interconnection and acceptance. And again, just like the previous process, pretty much all these steps have a specific timeline and deadline associated with them, so that the applicant has to turn around information in a specific time frame, and so doesn't the utility, and that helps keep the process moving forward. Next slide, please. Any questions before I get into the next slides? Okay, hearing none, I'll keep going. Some of these parts to the SIR are fairly new. We've had to modify the SIR quite a bit in recent years to keep up with the evolution of the industry and the more DG and DER that are interconnected in the system. We had to expand on the payment and construction milestones to make it more clear, just because of the complexity of the projects are increasing. So that's part D here. E, we actually added a couple years ago, was energy storage systems. The original SIR did not include energy storage systems. It only included, PV, so solar, wind, biogas, and a couple other technologies. So ESS was added, so that section E was developed, and then also section F along the same time frame, when energy storage systems were being brought into the mix, there were there's a lot of interest for combining projects and adding ESS to an existing PV project. So we had to develop rules for that. So that's kind of where section F came into play. And then also we developed an interconnection online application portal as part of a need and request from the industry. And this really helps track and identify the steps of the application process, where once the application submits online, the process and the progress of that application can be tracked and monitored through each utility's individual online application portal, and you can tell where the project sits, who's next, who's responsible for the next step. So that was a big push several years ago as well, and each of the utilities have that in place, and I think it's been a big help and benefit to the interconnection process. And then section H here is modifications. The more and more we got involved, there was questions, what happens if things change down the road, or if an existing project wants to add solar capacity to their existing site. So we developed these material modifications guidelines. And so there's some basic language in the SIR about this. We also have a guidance document that is referenced, and that's located on our DPS DG interconnection website, with more details on the rules and requirements and what identifies a material modification. In other words, it identifies, can the project move forward with just a simple update, or are the proposed changes of a nature that they need to resubmit a new application and go through the process, for the whole upgrade again. So that's the material modifications section. Next slide, please. And then the section 2 of the SIR is based around interconnection requirements. And you can see here, there's several topics of interest in the design requirements. These are meant to identify the minimum requirements for interconnection. Many of the utilities have their own specific standards for interconnections. For example, the National Grid has their own electric service bulletin 756 that identifies, specific, more detailed requirements for interconnection. I think like Orange and Rockland has a specific interconnection blue book. So those go into much more details. What's identified in the SIR again is just kind of the minimum requirements. So for voltage response, frequency response, and reconnection to the utility system, specific requirements for synchronous and induction generators, inverters, where we talk about the requirement for IEEE 51, or excuse me, UL 1741, and then kind of the minimum protection function requirements, and then metering requirements. Next slide, please. Then it kind of continues more in terms of the interconnection requirements, in terms of operating requirements, the requirements for dedicated transformers, disconnect switch, power quality, power factor, islanding. Again, with equipment certification, this is a big one. Just talked about a little bit. We require all the inverters to be certified and tested to UL 1741, the latest version of UL 1741, which is kind of the guidance for IEEE 1547. The latest version now is an SB version, and that's all identified in there. We need to get testing and certification requirements from a nationally recognized testing laboratory. Staff maintains a list of all these, not all of them. We've maintained a list of ones that have been provided to us to help move the process along. But if they don't need to be on our list, the utilities just use our list as a kind of a filter to help reduce their efforts. So if an inverter isn't on our list, they would just need to do their review and analysis from their side. But if it is on our list, we've already done that review analysis on our side. Then we get into there's requirements for the verification testing. And then lastly we have an interconnection inventory requirement with the SIR. And so the utilities, we have a running database that is posted on our DPS website that identifies all the projects that have been interconnected and are also in the queue by each utility. And that information is updated on a monthly basis. Utilities submit their updated databases to staff. We do a cursory review of it and then post it on a DPS website. And that's another tool for applicants to look at information and see where projects may or may not have competition or be better placed in certain areas on the system. Again, that's all posted on our DPS website. And then there's section 3 is just a glossary of terms, standard terms that are used throughout the SIR. Next slide, please. And then we have our the appendices of the SIR, and these have grown significantly over the last several years in terms of some of the efforts and issues that we've run into to help keep up with industry standards and again the overall interest in interconnections in the state. So we have a standard contract as Appendix A, And just in the last 2 years, we had to add, some modifications to those standard contracts specifically for federal agencies and state agencies like that Appendix A-2. That was the reason for the most recent changes to the SIR just past February, was for specific considerations for state agencies in the contract. And then we've got the contract for inverter-based and non-inverter-based projects as part of Appendix B and C. Pre-application report. This is a tool that was developed, several years ago to help applicants be able to get information about a specific site and its viability through a pre-application before they have to submit the full-blown application and spend the money on it. So the utilities have a specific turnaround time frame for this. The applicant submits specific information, and then there's specific information provided back to the applicant, I think within a 10 business day time frame. So a pretty quick turnaround to find out, some high level information about the viability of a project at a certain location. In just recent years, we've made a lot of changes for cost sharing options through the SIR, and those are all identified in Appendix E. We have an application checklist to help move things along as much as possible so that, the minimum requirements, if you check all these boxes, you should be able to get an approved application back from the utility within a time frame instead of, going back and forth, the utility saying, well, this is missing, resubmit, gets back with something else missing. This is an attempt to help speed that process along. So you got the minimum application requirements. Then there's the application screening I talked a little bit about before in Appendix G. And these are specific technical screens that the utilities apply to each project to determine, the impact. And if the project passes all the screens, then it can move forward without needing a CSER, a full-blown impact study. But if you are failing some of the screens, then it typically is going to have to get pushed off and have to go through a CSER. So go through the whole 60-day business or 60 business day impact study process. And then Appendix H is acknowledgement of property owner consent. So this allows, the owner to sign their, give their permission to a developer to move forward and kind of speak on their behalf through the process. We ran into some problems with that at one point in time, so we put this in to help avoid those issues. Moratorium. There was another issue that we ran into with areas, specific towns or villages or whatever, identifying moratoriums. So we put in some information about that to help move things along and identify when there's a moratorium in place and offer better options for applicants. And then there's a site control form. Appendix K is energy storage. This is a process that once we added energy storage systems, we needed specific information associated with the operation and control of the energy storage system. So this is all laid out in Appendix K. It's additional information on top of what a typical PV would be. It's much more in-depth and detailed, specific for the energy storage system that the utilities need to do their design and impact studies. And then lastly, we have a project's construction schedule that the utilities are supposed to fill out and provide to the customer or the applicant at a specific time in the process. And we were getting all different kinds of construction schedules in different forms. So we determined it was best to kind of put a template on in the SIR as part of an appendix here to help move things along in a more standardized process. So again, all these appendices have been, we've been adding to them as we go, updating quite often, and including them as needed as we move through the evolution of the SIR. I'll stop there. Been talking quite a bit. Any questions for me right now before I go on any further? Hearing none. Okay, next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of the overall general process and procedures with the SAR. The SIR was started back in 1999. It's been modified multiple times, as I've talked about, to keep up with and adapt to changes in state and commission policy and the overall DER industry. Beginning in 2016, developers and utilities proposed amendments through a collaborative process involving interconnection policy and technical working groups, the IPWG and ITWG. So when there's changes to the SIR proposed, they're identified, discussed, agreed upon within those groups, and then a official petition is filed with the commission. And as long as everything is good to go, it gets approved by the commission and adopted into the SIR. Any changes to the SIR require Public Service Commission approval, because the SIR is actually part of utility tariff. So that kind of gives the commission some teeth in terms of ensuring that the utilities follow the process and procedures identified in the SIR. So they have, very little discretion to vary from the rules or grant extensions. But part of, my role and the state and utility ombudsperson's roles is to assist and navigate, through the rules of the SIR and, address any issues and concerns that come up. Next slide, please. So this kind of gives just a high level view of the interconnection working groups. Really the main thing here to look at is, there's two separate groups, but there is a lot of overlap between the two. There's a lot of coordination, and a lot of the topics that we talk about, traverse between the two groups. So a lot of overlap between the two groups, even though, they are independent and operate and function independently. We talk to each other very closely, and if one thing's identified for change in the IT group, it's just also discussed and brought up in the IP group and vice versa. And you can see on the sides, just those are some of the topic areas that each of the groups have more recently tackled and addressed and included into the SIR. Next slide. So this slide is specific for the IPWG. It's the goal is to develop consensus-based solutions and recommendations on policy issues related to the interconnections of DER on a statewide basis. The group meets monthly and is really stakeholder-driven agendas. In other words, staff doesn't set the agendas for these two groups. We allow the representatives of the groups to set the agendas so that that ensures the topics being discussed are important to them and not driven just by staff. The IP includes representatives from utilities, project developers, trade associations, non-governmental organizations, and customer representatives. And just some of the more recent topics were queue management, material modifications, integration of energy storage systems, queue coordination, construction issues, cost sharing modifications. And each group has a specific website on our DPS DG webpage with more information. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Next slide, please. And so the ITWG is, the goal there is to identify, discuss, and resolve technical barriers and challenges affecting the interconnection of DG and DER on a statewide basis. Representatives from state agencies, utilities, and DG developers. We also have technical consultants that are part of the group We've used them several times in the past. Some of them have been, EPRI and Patera. We've used them to help identify and provide feedback and recommendations on more technical solutions. Some of the topics we've covered in the ITWG group is ground fault overvoltage or 3VO, anti-island protections, DTT, monitor control. Also talked about flicker screening and flexible interconnection, energy storage systems, and smart inverter functionality. And again, the ITWG has its own website as well. Next slide, please. I've mentioned this a couple times. Again, this is just a slide to show that we do have our DPS DG website. And I think it's a very good tool to reference and to maybe bookmark, and it identifies a lot of good information associated with each of the groups and everything associated with the SIR and interconnections. Next slide. So some of the things that we have listed on the DPS website is for DG and DR, the latest version of the SIR, obviously. We typically, when we update the SIR, the latest version goes up. We also put a red line from the previous version to help identify what has changed. Meeting information for each of the two groups with links and agendas and other information associated with the meetings. Any specific reports or documents associated with each group's efforts. I had mentioned before the material modifications guidance document that's up on the DG website. There's several other guidance documents and other reports that have kind of come out of topics that we've discussed, through each of the groups, and those are identified identified and posted on the website. One of the big things is the ombudsman's effort. We started that several years ago, where each utility and the state has a ombudsman contact, a one point of contact for SIR/interconnection issues to help developers, have an easier way to ask their questions and get responses. So the contacts for each of those people are identified on the website. I mentioned the SIR inventory. Those links are up on the website too. Links to each of the utilities hosting capacity maps are on the website as well. The hosting capacity maps, are GIS maps where you can type in an address and it'll bring up the information on the area circuit and provide a level of hosting capacity available for DG/DER interconnection at that site. We have our UL 1741 equipment certification list I talked about. That's all on our website. And again, anything else related to SIR and the DER information is on the website. Next slide, please. So in terms of complaints, that's one of my responsibilities is for the most part answering phone calls and answering complaints from customers and developers and applicants. So we try to, address those complaints, with a specific utility and the overall SIR interconnection process. We do encourage the developers to use the utility ombudspersons first. That's usually one of my questions I ask a person who calls me up is, have you reached out to the ombudsperson first to allow them to follow that process and work through the utility first. And if they run into a roadblock or don't get satisfactory responses, then they can reach out to staff for assistance. So that's, going into the next bullet. If they're unsatisfied, we try to intervene and work collaboratively between the utility and the applicant to resolve the issues within the rules of the SIR. This is it's a shorter, unofficial process. We can't modify or change the rules of the SIR. Only the commission can do that. So we try to work within the bounds of the SIR and come to a collaborative resolution. And if that's not the case, if we can't come to that, then we go into the, you know, we just have to recommend that the applicant or developer can file a petition or declaratory ruling with the commission to get an official determination. But unfortunately, it's a longer official process that takes that at a minimum 6 months. So, you know, that's kind of our role here for as DPS staff to help navigate issues and concerns through the SIR process without having to go through an official petition or declaratory ruling with the commission. Next slide. And as far as our interconnection team, I'm the co-chair of the Interconnection Technical Working Group. Myself and Mike Razanowski is the other co-chair from NYSERDA. We lead the ITWG group. And from the IP side, we have Liz Grisero and Jim Hastings from NYSERDA. So those are kind of the overall New York State interconnection team contacts that we utilize for the SIR. And I think with that, that's my last slide. Any questions? Hopefully that was helpful. Hope I didn't go through it too fast. There's a lot there. Again, we're continually updating the SIR through the IP and ITWG groups efforts. And I think we have a pretty good process in place now. So we think it works well. And hopefully this process can be utilized as much as possible to use that experience for this new effort for electric vehicles and the efforts going forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I'm not seeing any hands raised or any questions, so I think we'll just move on to Katie. And Katie will be discussing the differences between the EV V1G and the DER interconnection. Are you all set, Katie?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All set for the next slide. So as Lisa mentioned, one more back, Lisa. There we go. As Lisa mentioned, staff asked us to compare the interconnection process that Jason just walked us through for distributed energy resources to how we typically connect EV load for a standard unidirectional EV charger or group of chargers, so what we're calling V1G. So Lisa, we can go to the next slide where we have this outlined, and you'll see at the top, it's two graphs, and the top graph and the top half of the slide really represents what Jason just walked us through. And the bottom half of the graph represents that connection of EV load only, just a standard unidirectional EV charger or group of chargers being connected to the grid. And the bottom half is going to reflect what was filed by Con Edison in our queue management straw proposal. In the midpoint order on EV infrastructure interconnection, the commission asked Con Edison to file that straw proposal to really discuss how we've managed our queue over the first half of the program. And part of doing so is providing this kind of project flow to our customers. So to just walk us through on the top half of the slide, this is again just kind of the graphical representation of what Jason walked us through. But first, you'll have an initial communication from the customer. At that point, the DER customer will submit an application. And this graph really shows what the utility activity is. So all of the timeframes that you see represented here are the timeframes that the utility is keeping in mind as they respond to customer inputs. So the utility will review the application. From there, preliminary screening happens. There's an option for additional supplemental screening if needed, and then the Caesar process can begin. And that's the same Caesar process that Jason just spoke about. After the Caesar work is completed, the applicant will commit to and pay for the construction upgrades. The system is installed, and then the process of requesting a test and the utility performing the verification test takes place before following the test, resulting in the permission to operate. So just orienting everyone to what is represented in the graph there. Now you can take your eyes down to the second half and see how that process compares to what a standard one-directional EV load project would go through. So a couple of big differences to call out. First, we do have an electrification assessment, a site assessment that's offered by our electrification advisory services for projects that are considering developing a site with EV chargers and want to understand if that site has enough capacity, if it's service adequate for the project that they're considering, for the EV charging load that they are considering. And at that point, the customer will have the option to meet with our team and get sort of an initial gauge of what the site constraints are. And then everything following that that's in black is really about the customer understanding what incentives its project is eligible for. So that has to do with where the project is located, whether it's publicly accessible or whether it's private, maybe in a private only, an apartment building only accessible to tenants, or maybe at a business that's reserving its parking lot and it's charging only for its fleet. All of those things determine what type of incentive and whether the project would be eligible for the incentives through the Make Ready program. So the customer submits an application to have its eligibility review and then receives that eligibility assessment. And then from there, the actual EV load can be studied. So the application is moved over to our interconnection teams. At Con Edison, we call those our energy services and customer engineering departments. And at that point, the utility conducts an engineering study to determine whether there need to be any upgrades to the site in order to accommodate that new EV load. And then from there, the customer receives a service determination, which says what upgrades need to happen in order to accommodate the new EV load. They have a conversation with our energy services and customer engineering team to really figure out what design option is going to work best for them. They may have modifications that they want to make to our initial design. And then from there, once the design is finalized, our program team can offer the final incentive quote, if you will, and an agreement can be actually executed between the developer and the utility on what incentives we project we will be able to pay out based on what costs are associated with that project. And then once that is finalized, then construction can take place. That can be, customer side and utility side construction. And once construction is completed, and there's a final checklist of items that have to be reviewed, including permits and the one-line diagram. After that is all finalized, the site is energized. And then we also have a verification test of sorts. It's different than in the DER world, but this is really to make sure that the chargers are configured the way that they said they would be, and that they're publicly accessible if they received the public incentive and so forth. And then after that verification happens, we're able to actually process the incentive payment and close out the project. And there's kind of a series of reporting that we ask our customers to do as the program goes on for the next 5 years. So that in a nutshell is kind of how these two processes compare. And, we feel at Con Edison and in our conversations with the other joint utilities that the existing process that you see there on the bottom half of the screen is supported by the best practices that Con Edison filed in the queue management straw proposal and works well for unidirectional charging, where it's just connecting EV load. But it is helpful in the context of all of the questions that we received in the last meeting on April 4th of this working group to think about how these two processes are alike or different and how they intersect when you're looking at an increase that we anticipate of vehicle to grid V2G projects, including where a battery is paired with the EV chargers themselves. And that's a process where these two, or a situation where these two processes sort of need to talk to each other. So I'm going to pause here and let's see. Lisa, do you want me to take questions now or wait till the end?
Sure. You have something from the chat from Zach Woogan from VGIC. It says, thank you for this comparison. It's very helpful for the V1G process. How does Con Ed JU think about how power control systems, co-located stationary storage, protective relays, etc., fit into this process? If customers don't opt for EAS assessment, would utility provide them with information at any point about these flexible service connection solutions? For example, if the estimated connection time is exceptionally long.
So
I
think, no, it's a good question. I think that part of this question, Zach, is going to be answered. I sort of anticipated some of these questions. So I made a few case studies that I think will help anticipate or help answer this question. So I might suggest that we go through those and then return to this question. And I think, in terms of if the project didn't go through EAS, EAS is something that we are really pointing to our customers to as often as possible. And it's, I have some colleagues in the room, but I think that if you started an incentive application, for example, and you realized that you needed EAS services, it's not like you've missed the boat and can't go back and consult EAS later on down the line. So there's no sort of like expiry date on when you can consult those services. But I think, so that's kind of speaking to the second part of your question. But I think the first part of your question, we can answer in some of the scenarios that are on subsequent slides. Okay, great. Any other questions?
Hi, Richard Sturdivant from New York Best.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, Katie. I just more generally wondering if you reviewed our comments. It was generally focused around harmonizing the queues, like you discussed, for the interconnection process for EV load versus vehicle to grid and energy storage on the grid. And I know that some of our members were concerned with the study order and priority to be available for hosting capacity, just because the power generation is evaluated through the SIR and the load through a separate utility process. So we want to make sure that we can address harmonizing these queues and have that discussion going forward in this group. Also, more specific point, just the complexities for vehicle to grid on an EV project in the application process. Some members were concerned that the EV project with vehicle to grid chargers are eligible for power ready incentives. However, the Con Ed customers have to submit a CSER study for vehicle to grid to go through the SIR process, and this is completely separate from the Power Ready application that triggers the separate application for energy services team. So we wanted to point out these two studies, how they're not very well linked, and we'd like to continue discussing and wonder if you have any comments on that currently.
Yeah, sure. So just to summarize, sort of like the ultimate aim for your members is for projects where there's load and, or excuse me, there's EV chargers and battery, including when V2G happens. You're looking to really harmonize the process of studying the load and studying the battery interconnection through the Caesar. And then the second point was making it clearer and as streamlined as possible the actual start of application where incentives are managed through Power Ready, but the V2G interconnection is requires application through Caesar. Did I summarize that correctly?
Yes.
Just paraphrasing back to you.
Yes, that was a good summary. I think it would be nice to work on that in this working group going forward. Have a focus on that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. I think we can talk about that as we go through a few case studies. Are there any questions about standard unidirectional interconnection before I go on to those case studies?
I don't see any other questions, Katie.
Okay, great. So just because of the nature of questions that we had last time, I thought it might be useful to prepare a few scenarios to examine how charging co-located with batteries, including the option for vehicle to grid exporting back to the grid, would be managed at Con Edison. And to Richard's point, this could be a jumping off point for future meetings of this working group, possibly even for later today, depending on Lisa's agenda and how we want to manage time. But I thought that they would be useful to kind of visualize. I do want to underscore, though, and Lisa, we can go to the next slide. I do want to underscore, though, that these kind of represent what I learned from speaking to our DER groups at Con Edison. So I can't speak to all of the other utilities processes in the JU. And this is really just, like for the sake of illustration, because I know in these working groups, it can be hard to digest the chat and lots of words. So hopefully this gives us something kind of concrete to anchor around. So first, I'm going to just quickly recap the Electrification Advisory Services, or EAS, that Zach asked about, and then I'm going to go into 3 scenarios. So Lisa, we can go to the first recap slide. So quickly, I just wanted to recap the EAS which is really designed to study EV load only when a project comes to us, but it's a really helpful starting point for all projects involving EV charger, and can kind of illuminate when a battery might make a lot of sense, or illuminate, to Zach's point, when there's going to be a slightly more complex process because the developer wants to use a battery. So it's just a really helpful touch point to get the project started and to make sure that the customer applicant knows all of the pieces that are required to get their project reviewed and studied by our engineering team. And so you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, EAS includes a site assessment, which is a preliminary review of grid capacity and really helps determine the site's capacity before a customer decides to invest resources in pursuing that. And you can see all the benefits here, one being that it really can save the participant time rather than they're starting an application that they ultimately decide, is not worth pursuing and is abandoned, that can divert resources from both the customer team and the utility team. And these services are also paired with some self-serve tools that are available on our website and are publicly available. They include a list of required documents that are needed for service determination for EV load. They include an EV charging rates calculator and a hosting capacity map that gives a snapshot of our service territory and where on our network there's sort of a range of color coding that corresponds to what level of capacity is available on our network. So I just wanted to preface the scenarios that we'll walk through with this reminder that is taken from our straw proposal. So we can go to the next slide, Lisa. So, okay, first scenario actually doesn't speak to either Richard or Zach's questions, but just to sort of root us in what a site assessment might look like, where a developer comes to work with our EAS team, and the result is that the site is service adequate for EV load, and then the customer decides, okay, I'm going to move forward and install standard unidirectional V1G chargers. This scenario that we dreamed up, it's a private parking lot. They're looking to install 36 L2 chargers. And as I said, the EAS team comes back and says, service adequate, no utility side upgrades required. And the customer is really prioritizing ease of application or ease of implementation. So they move forward and install the chargers through a typical load service application, or excuse me, a service determination for the EV load only. And then you can see, the steps here at the bottom mirror those stages that we looked at in this slide that I presented at the beginning that have kind of the full process flow. So that's the unidirectional case. The second case that we'll look at, if we can go to the next slide. So this is one where in this scenario, the site is not service adequate for the EV load that the participant comes to the EAS team with and says, this is the scope of our project. So at that point, our EAS team would say, okay, you could go through an SIR to consider the battery paired with EV load, and then you'll know the cost of interconnecting that battery. And in this scenario that we lay out on this slide, the customer does choose to install the battery. So here, the imaginary illustrative customer might be a business with a light duty fleet. They're looking to electrify 10 DCFC chargers. And as I said, the initial EAS team says our assessment here is the service is inadequate, and the priority for the customer is to contain costs and also pursue an earning opportunity by exporting back to the grid. So here, what you see is it gets a little complex. So I'll take you through the top part. The purple text represents that conversation with our electrification advisory services team, and then the EV program team will actually go through the incentive review, let the developer know whether they're eligible for incentives. And at the same time, and this is Richard and Zach, to your points, where maybe we have work to do to really make sure that we're being as clear with customers as possible as to how this process can work. And we might need to do a little roadshow of these slides and continue to build alignment here. But really what we envision is at the same time, the customer could start an application to connect the battery. And then the CSER study would look at both the EV load and the battery together. And that really replaces stage 3, the service determination stage of a traditional unidirectional EV study. And after the CSER is completed, then you would have construction for what upgrades are needed, or you would also have you'd also have the incentive determination in stage 4, but you'd also have the construction that's needed, and the interconnection of the battery and the energization of the chargers. And then we would continue to close out the incentive part of the EV interconnection, get the incentives paid out, and ask for reporting on those chargers. That's represented on the top right section of the screen. Okay, unfortunately, Zach has to jump, but we can always connect again, Zach. And
Katie, I'm sorry, this is embarrassing. Turns out I don't have to jump. I have my schedule mixed up. I do have a question.
Oh, okay.
So, if I may, so on closeout and reporting, and this is I think a broader question for V1G service connection. Is there a plan in place for or a desire for utilities to report out on an anonymized basis the timelines data? In other words, how long it takes for each of these steps in the process for each project, and then based on the different project characteristics, for example, one might expect smaller projects moving faster than larger projects, or projects that use, for example, a battery to maybe take a little bit longer than projects without a battery. But I'm just wondering if there's any possibility of collecting data on that and then publishing that with stakeholders in this group and beyond on a regular basis, just so we can track progress and understand where are the bottlenecks, where, is there a consistent point where bottlenecks seem to be popping up? And I believe, Con Ed and the joint utilities probably have a pretty clear sense of this, but I'm wondering whether creating more stakeholder understanding of where those bottlenecks are could be helpful. And again, like, how do those bottlenecks change based on the characteristics of the project, whether there is something like a power control systems or battery in place. So I guess it's a question about that number 8 reporting piece. What does that mean? Is that just reporting to the utility, or do the utilities have plans to report out to this group or other stakeholders more broadly?
Yeah, so to answer your question on what number 8 means, it's really actually about reporting from the networks and the site hosts of how those chargers are being used, so usage data. And that is important for the PSC to see kind of the efficacy of these incentive dollars. So in this context, it means something different than what you're discussing. So that's the short answer to your question. In terms of learnings, I mean, of course, we are always trying to learn where our bottlenecks are and make improvements across the utility. Con Edison specifically does have an EAM where we are incentivized to reduce the interconnection time duration that an EV project takes. And when we report out our progress, which determines whether we can earn that EAM or through the earnings adjustment mechanism, that part is holistically reported, but not through kind of individual projects. And I'll say that a lot of what, just by the by, as sort of an aside, a lot of what determines whether a project takes longer has to do with where it is located and what the constraints on the grid are for that specific part of the grid and that feeder location.
Thanks so much, Katie. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's on, I think it's helpful to have that summary data in the EAM, for the EAM purposes. And again, the more specific, so maybe it's an open question in the working group and something to revisit in the future is there value in having that more specific sort of project by project data, again, anonymized and of course, not overstepping on customer data, but to identify those bottlenecks and see what, because so for example, like one question that I know I'd be interested in learning more is like in cases where power control systems are used and stationary storage, how does that impact the timeline? And then that can help inform, what sort of where we can focus our attention moving forward. But anyway, I appreciate the comments, Katie, and the presentation at large. This is really helpful information, and it's great to see this discussion moving forward.
Okay, good. Glad that's useful. And we do have a third and final scenario before I turn it back to Lisa. And, I think that this is in the spirit of kind of our learning together, because a lot of these battery plus EV projects represent a really small percentage of the total EV projects that we're looking at now. So as they become more frequent, it is an opportunity for us to learn, and that's partially kind of what these illustrative slides are hoping to kickstart.
Can I just jump in with a clarifying question before we go to the third one?
Sure. Hi, Cole.
Hey, Katie. Yeah, folks, this is Cole Germain with EDF. So just in this case study here, I guess kind of a two-part question. One, does the customer need to submit two separate applications for like the EV interconnection portion of it and the battery and exporting interconnection of it? And then once that one application or two applications are in and it's going through the two parallel processes, what does the communication look like within Con Ed between those two teams leading up to the CSER process? And so like how much collaboration is going on to align the timelines for the project to, kick off that process as quickly as possible?
Yeah, it's a good question. Do you mind, Cole, if I present my last slide and then we can come back to it? And
Yep,
because
absolutely.
This last one also sort of involves a slightly different timeline, but one where coordination is important.
Great.
Okay, great. We will come back to Cole's question. So the last case study that I wanted to share is a situation where the customer comes to our EAS team and receives a site assessment that shows there's capacity that's adequate the site is adequate for about half of the EV load requested, and that could be considered kind of phase one of the project. But phase two could be possible only with a battery if you wanted to avoid any upgrades to the utility side part of the equation. So because in this example, the hypothetical customer is a municipal government that wants to make about 6 DCFC chargers available as quickly as possible, they're choosing to phase in the EV load. And so their priority is really speed, and they want to energize a group, in this case, half of the chargers first. So here in this scenario, again, it's hypothetical, but this is sort of how we envision we might help a customer based on their priorities. The three of the DCFC fast chargers would go through service determination with limited infrastructure upgrades, and then the CSER would be completed after that and take into consideration the whole package of the 6 chargers all together, so that with the battery, so that you can add those additional 3 chargers. So starting on the left-hand side of the graph, in the purple text, the customer goes through EAS. They realize that the site has capacity for just, or they realize that they're eligible for incentives. They certainly are as a public site, and they also realize that the capacity for the site is only for about 3 of those DCFC chargers. And then the service determination application would begin for 3 chargers, and we would work to help them simultaneously start the application for the battery and all 6 of the chargers included in that Caesar study. So there's this option if speed is really the priority for the customer to phase in 3 of the chargers through typical utility connection to the grid. And then if the customer chooses, after understanding the costs associated with adding a battery, to support 3 additional chargers and how that compares to utility side costs for upgrades that would be needed for the 3 additional chargers, then they can choose, I want to add the battery and the 3 chargers or not. So this is sort of an illustration of that phased approach. Okay, so I'm going to pause there. And we'll go back to some of the questions.
We do have a question. It says, don't some utilities require participation in the vehicle incentive program in order to participate in their infrastructure incentives? It's not for their infrastructure incentives. It's for the medium heavy duty pilot program for incentives to get an electric vehicle. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's part of the requirements for the medium heavy duty pilots. In order to qualify for funding and participate in the pilot program, they do require you to participate in an eligible incentive program, such as the New York State Bus Incentive Program. I think Clean Bus Program in the past was part of this as well.
So I hope that answers your question, Ed. And I don't see any other, Katie, questions or hands up.
No, but I just wanted to go back to Cole's question.
Okay, great.
So Cole, I would just say that the black part of this graphic where it's incentive determination, that's always going to require its own application. But then from there, once we move on to the blue part of these lines, the utility teams are closely coordinating. So, it might look like, okay, we need, these 5 documents to consider the chargers, and we need this for the Caesar, but it's all getting looked at by the same team.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, I would say as much as those applications can be, I don't know if it's combined or standardized, like if they're asking for the same information, to the extent that a fleet or other customer would just need to give that information once, or have all of it in one online form, and it is split up on the utility side and sent to whichever department needs the relevant information from the application overall. That may be helpful in just making it easier on the customer side, rather than making it 2 separate, partially repetitive applications. The other thought I had looking at this third example is, I think the one case study that I'm interested in, that it sounds like Zach is interested in as well, is a customer that is using load management technologies, whether that's a battery or battery and solar or energy management system, something not to get the second half of the chargers online faster, but to get the first half of the chargers. If it's a customer that needs to manage their load to get that first bank of chargers online while the service upgrade is happening, and they still want the service upgrade to add chargers later on, I think it would be important at some point for this working group to talk about how that could work as well, where you're using, whether it needs to go through the Caesar process or something else, to help the customer connect those load modifying technologies in the near term while the upgrades are happening later on, rather than kind of the reverse, which is what this case study sounds like.
Right. Yeah. I think that we can speak to that question because some folks who work a little bit closer to batteries have weighed in. And Cole, really, we do consider load management technologies, both hardware and software, to allow for bringing those chargers on sooner. The way that, you know, this case study here was saying we'd try to bring them on sooner just through a standard connection, but what you're saying is to bring them on sooner through load management. So we do allow for that, but there's a caveat that any configuration also needs to comply with New York City building code that could, for example, require software to be paired with a hardware solution, you know, there's an example here that we can speak to where we had a large project with hundreds of L2 projects installed using load limiting software and a fused switch. And we were able to get them online with no grid upgrades. And then from there, you know, that leaves room for the utility to build the grid in parallel to really reduce the software limits as needed in the future. But this is sort of the typical kind of bridge, almost like tech bridge to wire solution, if I can make up my own term for a minute.
I like it. I'll start using that one. No, that's helpful. Thanks, Katie. And yeah, I agree. The New York City building code issue could be a constraint for some of these. And I don't know if this working group is the right place to talk about that or where else, but that may be something that some groups need to start working on in a more concerted way at some point.
Sure. So there are lots of, I mean, I think we're hearing from the group, there are lots of different inputs that can help alleviate, you know, when we're capacity constrained, and certainly load management, either hardware or software, is one. The battery that we saw in the previous example is another. So room for creativity as we can continue to see more projects interested in these various configurations.
Sounds great. Thank you.
And Zach, if just to clarify, I also got a message from a team member who's more closely working on EAS. If the project did not go through EAS initially, then the team would still be ready to discuss these strategies and technology once the service determination is provided. So if the service determination came back and, you know, it was a surprise to the developer or not exactly what they had expected, then, you know, we could look at some of these solutions together.
That's really helpful. Thanks. Yeah, I want one thing. It's you know, it's a tough balance because I'm not sure if how much we want to like add additional process if we don't need it, but there may be some need to just define the last thing you said, right? If that determination is like unexpected, is there a specific trigger, like a certain target timeline, and if it's past that timeline, then it initiates a discussion about, you know, UL, you know, 3141 PCS and the software side or hardware side. Like, is there a specific trigger, or is every single site going to receive that treatment? Because I just, you know, I wonder if that's another thing we might want to discuss at some point in this working group, is like, you know, it's kind of an unexciting process element, but like, you know, is there a specific determination that you know, that triggers that discussion about these more flexible service connection solutions, or scaled, like what's on this slide, a scaled service connection solution, as opposed to it being every single site. Maybe it is every site, maybe it's just some, I don't know necessarily. It's just something that might merit discussion here.
Fair. And I think just to kind of round out these sets of questions, Richard, to go back to your question, one thing that my team also wanted to add is we certainly would love to continue to hear what pain points your members bring forth and suggestions for improving. And we are also thinking about how to improve the customer experience because, you know, as we said, these cases are a very small proportion of what we're seeing right now, but we do expect them to increase in the future. So I think one question that I had, Lisa, is if you wanted to go kind of back to the initial questions that you had posed to the group, and we maybe pause the discussion on the V to G side.
You have we do have another question from Michael Callender. It says, in scenario where V1G site is inadequate, does the EAS support the battery sizing interconnection application? Or is it the customer's responsibility to conduct the analysis to service their EV load profile?
And could you also provide your organization for DPS?
Michael.
So yeah, it is we don't advise on the battery sizing. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I was just kind of see where the EAS stops and then a separate development process begins. If someone was asking for the organization, it's clean capital. And just a quick follow-on question: behind the meter generation, does this process contemplate addition of new generation on the customer side of things, or would that just go through a usual process?
Could you repeat that again? If there's new generation on the customer side?
Yeah, if we bring in like our own on-site solar, cogen, et cetera, to fill a gap in the delay of upgrades from Con Ed or another utility, does this process contemplate that scenario? Just curious if you guys are thinking through that.
If there's anything that's being exported back to the grid, from alternative generation like solar, it would have to go through the Caesars. So that would have, in this particular illustrative example, that would have to happen in this kind of teal blue section. Because, as Jason described, the Caesar is really where, where we look at that distributed energy resource and where we look at exporting back to the grid. But is there anything to add to that?
Nope, you nailed it.
Okay. So yeah, hope that's clear. I think it's a different situation if it's like a closed system where it's just solar attached to an EV charger.
Yeah, that's the perfect clarification. I was just looking for, like, we're basically building a system external to this process in that scenario. And last question, I did cut out a little bit earlier. I was curious on the lack of prescribed timelines for the V1G. Could you just explain that detail and if that's forthcoming or why that's written the way it is?
Yeah, so the way that our process has worked to date is we are giving customers a timeline range when they enter the service determination application, and it varies based on complexity of the project. But we always say we're able to give kind of the median range, and then if the project is more complex or less complex, indicate that relative to the median, indicate that to the customer. But it's different than the timelines that Jason was speaking about in the previous example.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
So getting back to your previous question, Katie, Anna, whether we should continue with the V2G. I think it's probably a good idea if we continue the questions. We could probably move to the next meeting. We're just forming this group and we're trying to get an idea of what we want to address and maybe a timeline on when to address them. So I think since Jason's on the phone and you're on the phone, and I think or in the meeting, we can continue the discussion if everybody else is willing to do that. Oh, we just got another question too. Can you share some information on this site with the switch and load management software with L2 chargers that you were mentioning, Katie?
We can't share specific customer information. So if there's a project that you're conceiving of, then you could certainly contact our EAS team and they could walk through, what the site is that you're interested in, where it sits on our grid, and whether it might be a good candidate for load management software. And that's what the EAS team is there for.
We want to continue the discussion. I'm not seeing anything else. Chat or hands raised. Can you do a quick scroll? Okay, why don't we just continue with what we have, unless Katie, you have something else that you'd like to discuss?
Nope, no, I just wanted to offer those examples, but we can move on.
That was awesome and really, really, really helpful, especially the case study. So thank you so much for all that work that you put into this. Very helpful.
Sure.
So at the last EVIIWG meeting, staff had posed some questions that we thought could help form and guide this group. And I'm just gonna. So the first question was suggestions on the format and organization of the EVIIWG. Are there any opinions or suggestions on how we want to format and organize this? Do we want to meet on a monthly basis? Does anybody have any suggestions on this? Oh, what does it say? Oh, Lauren, you're off mute, I think.
I am. Hi, Lisa and everyone. This is Lauren Kastner from ICF. Speaking on behalf of the joint utilities, I'll give Katie a little bit of a break after that presentation. Lisa, I can kick it off just with a little bit of feedback on your first question. In general, I think the joint utilities are happy with the format and suggestion for a monthly cadence of this working group. I think as stated in the order, really the intention of this working group was to be temporary and narrowly focused on EV project queue management, to make sure that we can, stay focused on that issue and resolve any outstanding issues and concerns from stakeholders fairly expeditiously. So I think we're happy with that, and it would be helpful to put some bounds around the focus. And so that's really on kind of the format side. I think in terms of the scope, as I think we just discussed, and we're starting to illuminate with the case studies from the Con Edison team. The joint utilities think it's pretty important for this working group and for stakeholders to distinguish between different use cases for EV charging projects. So as Katie laid out, there are the overwhelming majority of projects that the joint utilities are receiving through the Make Ready program are those kind of one directional or V1G use cases that are load only and are not subject to the SIR process. At the same time, we recognize that those type of charging projects that will intend to utilize some kind of bidirectional charging or additional load management technology are emerging. And those are important to plan for. But I think it would be helpful for this working group to distinguish between those use cases and be really precise with the recommendations that end up in the final straw proposal or white paper, to make sure that we're kind of solving for the right issue, so to speak. And I think through the working group process over the coming months, it would be helpful for the working group and for stakeholders to continue providing input on those specific use cases that take priority. I think, especially the ones that are most common or are, potentially caught up in some kind of backlog, which, as Con Ed has shared before, is really has been due to the incentive review process as opposed to an engineering bottleneck. So just to wrap it up, I think, again, the JU is happy with this format, and we just want to be as narrowly focused and precise as possible for the most common and most impactful use cases.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Lauren. Thoughtfulness that you put into that answer. And I think staff is in agreement. So we can move on, unless anybody has anything else, we can move on to the next question. So ideas from other jurisdictions, and this is just how maybe other jurisdictions dealt with or deal with interconnection of EVs. If there's, anything that another jurisdiction might have that we want to incorporate or learn lessons from. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Alrighty, we can move on to the next one, which is should the interconnection process for EVs be separate from or added as a modification to the current standard interconnection requirement process for distributed energy? And it might have been sort of answered in the first question. Does anybody have any ideas on this?
Lisa, I can speak again on behalf of the JU. This is one that we had a chance to coordinate on because you so helpfully shared this in the last meeting. And you're right that Lauren alluded to it earlier, and I think I may have as well, but the JU does feel that the interconnection process for standard one directional EV charging, or V1G, should be kept separate from the SIR process for distributed energy resources, so as to allow for the fastest and best customer experience for EV charging project developers specifically. There's certainly, as we've heard today, an opportunity to improve the coordination across utility departments and clarification for customers on what that coordination across utility departments looks like when it comes to V2G EV charging interconnections. So I think, we're all excited to participate on that, and later on in this forum or in a different forum. And I think, it's important to understand in that scenario how the SIR process for DERs aligns with EV interconnection. And we did a little bit of that work already today. I would just add that the current V1G EV interconnection process allows for broad diversity of project types, some that are very small with just a few chargers, some that includes many DCF chargers in grid constrained areas. And the current process allows utilities to innovate and evolve with the market and constantly improve their processes while driving towards an excellent customer experience. And we think that it's important to really underscore speed with thoughtful variation based on project complexity when trying to deliver the best possible customer experience, rather than trying to drive towards a lowest common denominator across these very varied EV interconnection projects. And then, as we alluded to earlier, there is a EAM for Con Edison for EV charging interconnections, and then an EAM for the whole JU for plug targets. And those have proven to be strong in aligning the enterprise, that meaning the utility enterprise, getting all of the departments coordinated and focused on the quickest execution possible while keeping safety and customer value top of mind. And then finally, I just wanted to note that if anyone missed it, the current V1G EV incentive program interconnection process is described in the straw proposal that was filed on March 15th and is available in the document matter system, matter management system. And the proposal really reflects the many improvements that Con Edison made over the first half of the Make Ready program as the market grew and evolved and customer interest grew and customer needs changed. So, our position is that these improvements were made in part in response to customer feedback and their customer suggestions for improvement. And the JU feels that and recommends that this working group really identify which elements of the straw proposal merit additional amplification or modification. And from there, the utilities can focus on sharing and aligning around best practices that were identified in that straw proposal, and really using this working group to propagate those lessons and form them into guidelines that yield benefits across the state. So, for example, if the working group identified customer communication as kind of a prime area for amplification, the JU could identify and align on ways to better inform customers of changes in project status or something of that nature.
Katie, you're going in and out a little bit, and we have a hand raised from,
Hey,
Zach.
yeah, I put it down for a moment just because I don't want to sound like too much of a broken record. But again, on this, I think it was the third bullet here. I think this is where that data collection could be really useful, right? Reporting out and having a really solid understanding of how, you could picture a table with all the projects listed and sort of a check mark with certain columns. And one of the columns would be, is there also an SIR request for this project? And then we can see how that impacts the timeline when there's both a SIR and a V1G request. And then, that data collection might help guide policy development in the future. Of course, it'll take time to collect that data, especially given that there aren't that many projects that have both V1G and the SIR DER request. But it just might be valuable to collect data. Not that the anecdotal evidence that we have so far isn't valuable, because I think it is. And I think that what we're hearing from our members and what it sounds like New York Best and perhaps EDF also have heard from folks, that's very real experience. And there is friction with, having to have two separated processes. But I just think, collecting data beyond the anecdotal might be helpful in helping answer this question in, say 6 months or a year or however long from now, we have a better sense of how these different projects move through at different speeds based on their characteristics.
I think that's a great idea, Zach, and definitely will take that for consideration. Richard, you have your hand raised?
Yes, comment. Richard, New York Best. One point I want to put out there is us and our members believe that currently the fewer V2G projects is partially due to the barriers put in place by the existing queue management and interconnection application processes. And I just want to make sure that we don't disadvantage the deployment of these technologies compared to unidirectional assets. And overall, New York Best does support the general content of the straw proposal that's been submitted, but we'd like to make sure that V2G is not disadvantaged in this process. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we agree with that. And we'll see. I think we just want to, we'll be addressing that when it becomes, we'll be prepared. We're trying to get prepared for when it becomes more prevalent, which we'll be addressing in this group. Does anybody have any other hand raises or no? So we'll move on to the fourth question, which is how should changes in EV technology and policy be incorporated into the EV specific interconnection process?
I'll
So-
jump in on this. Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go first.
This is Cole Germain with EDF. Just one thing I would say on this is I don't think, changes need to be technology specific. I think maintaining, the requirements and designing the interconnection expectations around like a technology neutral framework can be useful to give both the utilities and customers flexibility to use the solutions that work best for them. So, the interconnection process should be updated based on changes in available technology and should account for that, but doesn't need to be technology specific in its solutions.
Okay, and Zach?
Yeah, thanks. I think building on that, this is a very discrete suggestion, which is just keep an eye out on the emergent UL 3141 standard. I think it's currently a standard outline, but it's something that it's of course it's not going to proliferate overnight through different EV EMS products and solutions and software stacks, but that's an expected change and sort of capabilities to come, and something that this group and utilities should keep an eye on.
And Joshua?
Yeah, this is Joshua Kaplan from National Grid, sort of sharing an answer for this one on behalf of the utilities, joint utilities. And here, yeah, pretty similar to what was shared by EDF, that maintaining it to be technology neutral, and then as technical requirements require that standards get updated, we kind of follow the existing standard processes. So similar to how Jason was describing how the SIR process has been updated over time as new technologies and new needs have come before that group, and there's a process already in place to handle that, particularly on the sort of the vehicle to grid side. Additionally, for the joint utilities, really we want to make sure that no technology is prioritized over other technologies, and that so it's neutral and allow the market to sort of align to the technologies that best meet their needs. So that's sort of our take for that question.
Thank you, Dave. Those were all very, very helpful. Don't see any other hands. So we can move on to the next question. And are there any billing and crediting issues to anticipate? It's an open-ended question. I'm not sure if we even have an answer for this, but we just wanted to throw it out there. Hearing nothing, I think maybe it's something that we just keep in mind as we continue forward with this group. And then lastly, are there any other considerations that should be taken into account? Another open-ended question. Okay, it's something that we can, think about as we move forward with this group. So thank you so much for everybody's involvement in helping answer these questions and helping shape this group. Let's see, next slide. So for the next steps for this group, we have a meeting scheduled for June 7th. And I'm getting, continue to send the edits and comments of the straw proposal. We've gotten quite a few right now. I'm summarizing them and, putting them into editing the straw proposal as appropriate. And I'll share that. I hope to have the comments and edits maybe by next meeting, so I can share it with everybody. And I'm working to continue to work on it. The straw proposal can be found on DMM in case 18E0138 and on our webpage. And we will modify the proposal, hopefully to discuss at the next EVIIWG meeting, depending on how much comments we get, but probably. And for future discussion, if we can all provide a list of any of the issues and barriers encountered when connecting EVs, and we can maybe address them one at a time. Does anybody have anything else? I would just really like to thank Katie for her wonderful presentation and Jason for his wonderful presentation. They were both very, very helpful and filled with information. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and I look forward to seeing everybody on June 7th. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.